Hello everyone, welcome to the Scientific Stories, where science meets the magic of storytelling. No boring lectures, no scary formula, just the fun, a little wonder, and magic of those wow moments. And yes, everything here is in real human voices, no robotic or AI voices, just heart to heart talk. So, come on, let's start a new chapter of science, but this time truly from the heart. And please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates.
The Krail came to end us on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday meant anything to them. They did not have Tuesdays. They had a 31-hour cycle built around 3 suns and a moon that was actively trying to escape its own orbit, and they've been a spacefaring civilization for 9,000 years. And in that 9,000 years, they had absorbed, dismantled, or simply erased 42 species who had made the mistake of being in the way of wherever the Krail decided to expand next. They sent the fleet first, the way you send a hand to brush a fly off a table. Not even their war fleet, their colonial fleet, the one they used for occupation rather than combat. The distinction being that combat implied the other side had something worth fighting with. Humanity, from the Krail's perspective, did not. They had assessed us for 11 years before they arrived. 11 years of observation satellites. So advanced we thought they were asteroids, drinking in every transmission, every weapon test, every military exercise that leaked radio signal into space. They built models. They're xenomilitary analysts, a profession that in 9,000 years of expansion had become extremely good at its job. Ran projections. The projections were unanimous. Humanity could be processed in 42 standard cycles. Maybe fewer. The species had nuclear weapons, which was noted, and were awarded the classification of moderately inconvenient in the threat matrix, which was the same classification given to the Davari of Sector 12, who had lasted 63 standard cycles before the end, and were considered the most resistant species the Krail had ever subdued. The analysts were thorough. The analysts were good. The analysts had made one error. They had looked at every weapon test humanity had ever conducted. They had cataloged every military transmission, every defense budget, every hardware specification that had ever been broadcast or leaked or transmitted in the direction of space. They had seen everything humanity was willing to show. They had not seen what humanity was saving. What humanity was saving was not a weapon. It did not have a name in any Krail language. It did not have a name in most human languages either, not a clean one. There were phrases, technical designations, classification codes that civilian governments didn't know existed, buried inside a program that had started as a research project 60 years before the Krail arrived, and had been consuming budget and brilliant people in absolute silence ever since, because the people running it understood something that required a very specific combination of intelligence and historical imagination to understand. The universe was old. The universe was large. Something was going to come. And when it did, nuclear weapons were not going to be enough. So they had not built better nuclear weapons. They had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that required you to look at physics, not as a set of rules to operate within, but as a set of locks, and to spend 60 years building keys. The Krail fleet arrived in the outer solar system on a Tuesday. 42 warships arranged in the formation that had ended 42 civilizations, broadcasting surrender terms on every detectable frequency. Earth went quiet, not the quiet of fear, the quiet of something that has been waiting a long time finally, hearing the knock it was expecting. What the Krail were about to learn, at a cost they would not finish counting for generations, was that there's a vast, unbridgeable difference between a species that doesn't have weapons and a species that decided long ago that weapons were too small a category for what they were preparing for. They had brought battleships. Humanity had brought something that didn't have a name yet. It needed one now. The surrender broadcast was, by every technical measure, a masterwork. The Krail had been refining it for 9,000 years, a living document updated after each absorption, each dismantling, each erasure, incorporating every lesson learned about how species receive the end of their independence. It came in 47 languages simultaneously, each version not merely translated but culturally calibrated. The Davari version had emphasized honor and legacy. The Veluan version had leaned heavily on the mathematical certainty of the outcome. The version broadcast to humanity was warm, almost gentle, acknowledging Earth's achievements with the specific patronizing admiration of a developer praising the architectural character of a neighborhood it was about to demolish. The broadcast had a 96% compliance rate across the 42 species it had been used on. The 4% who did not comply were cataloged, studied, and factored into the next revision. It went out on all detectable frequencies at 0347 Greenwich Mean Time, Tuesday, April 14th. Every receiver on Earth capable of picking up a signal received it. Every government, every military, every amateur radio enthusiast with a dish pointed at the right patch of sky got the same message in their own language, translated by a system that had 11 years of practice. Earth's response arrived 47 minutes later. It was 11 words. "We have received your transmission. Please stand by for our response." Asterisk the Krail Fleet Commander, a rank-cast officer named Velkareth who had overseen 3 planetary absorptions and was therefore considered seasoned for this assignment, noted the reply in his log, and found it neither alarming nor interesting. "Please stand by" was not an unfamiliar response. Some species needed time to process. Some needed to perform the ritual of appearing to deliberate before accepting the inevitable. He gave the order to maintain position at the outer system boundary and let Earth have its 48 standard hours. His xenomilitary analyst, a sharp-minded secondary caste specialist named Drew Veleth, who had flagged 7 anomalies in the 11 years of Earth observation that nobody had given significant weight to, noted the reply in her own log and was less comfortable with it. The phrase "please stand by" was standard. The phrase for our response was not. Species receiving surrender terms did not typically frame their position as one from which a response would be forthcoming. They stalled. They argued, they requested clarification, they transmitted anguish on wideband frequencies for a few hours before their governments accepted the reality. They did not, in Drew Veleth's experience, use language that implied a reply of substance was being prepared. She flagged it. The flag was noted. The flag was not escalated. She went back to her anomaly files and read them again, looking for the 7th one that had kept her uneasy since she'd first logged it 3 years ago. A thermal bloom in a desert region of the planet's largest southern continent that lasted 11 days, followed by complete electromagnetic silence from a 500-kilometer radius around the site, which was not the signature of any weapons system she had in her database, but was also not the signature of an extremely large contained energy event of a type she did not have in her database. She had no category for it. She did not like not having categories. At 12 o'clock GMT on Tuesday, 8 hours and 13 minutes after the Krail broadcast, a woman named Dr. Yeva Marchetti walked into a room that did not officially exist in a facility that did not officially exist 17 stories beneath a stretch of Australian desert that official maps labeled as a protected geological survey zone, and said to the 12 people waiting for her, "They're at the outer boundary. 42 ships in column absorption formation. Fleet composition matches the projections." The 12 people in the room represented, collectively, 60 years of work. Some of them had been there for 20 of those years. 2 of them had been there for 40. The oldest, Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, who was 81 years old and moved with the specific, deliberate pace of a man who had learned decades ago that hurrying was a form of imprecision, had been present for the original meeting in 1987 at which the program's founding mandate was established. He remembered every word of that meeting. He remembered specifically the words of the director who'd convened it, a career intelligence officer named Cavendish who'd spent 12 years analyzing signals from space that nobody in the official scientific community wanted to officially acknowledge, and who had finally gotten a room full of the right people and said, "Asterisk, we've been assuming that when contact happens, it will be contact. I am asking us to assume it will be something else, and to build for that instead. Asterisk Cavendish had been dead for 19 years. He would have found a day satisfying. Marchetti pulled up the fleet display on the room's central screen. Blue markers for the Crail positions, orbital projections in white, Earth's defensive infrastructure in green, and a fourth color, a deep amber, for the assets that didn't appear on any defensive infrastructure map that the governments of Earth had ever been shown. The amber positions were in 3 clusters, one in high Earth orbit, massed inside what appeared to be a decommissioned weather satellite array, one deep underground on the southern continent, at the site of Drew Velith's thermal bloom, one at a classified lunar installation that was officially a geological research station and unofficially the most expensive single structure humanity had ever built. The room looked at the amber positions for a moment. 48 hours, Marchetti said. That's what the initial broadcast implied. They'll hold position and wait. They'll send a follow-up at the 30-hour mark, said Dr. Nadia Osei, the team's strategic modeling specialist, who had been doing nothing but running Crail behavioral projections for 6 years, and at this point understood how the Crail Fleet Command thought better than most Crail Fleet commanders understood themselves. The follow-up will be more specific about consequences. Still not hostile action. They won't commit to hostile action until the 48-hour window closes. They're procedural. Good, Marchetti said. Procedural we can work with. She looked at Tanaka. He was standing at the edge of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the amber positions on the screen with an expression that contained 60 years of work and the specific weight of a man who had given his life to building something he hoped would never need to be used, now watching the moment arrive when it needed to be used and not feeling the satisfaction he'd expected. Dr. Tanaka, she said. It's ready, he said. He didn't look away from the screen. All 3 nodes. Full integration. The lunar array came online this morning. Katri's team finished the coupling sequence at 0-200. The energy cost, said a younger member of the team, Dr. Raj Sundar, 43, systems architecture, the person most directly responsible for the power infrastructure, and therefore the person who had woken up this morning with an existential appreciation of the phrase, you only get one shot at this. Sustainable for 11 minutes at full output, Tanaka said. After that, the coupling degradation rate exceeds the regeneration rate, and we lose coherence. 11 minutes is the window. The room processed this. 11 minutes. Against 42 warships representing the colonial fleet of a civilization 9,000 years older than writing. Tell me about the ships, Sundar said. Marchetti pulled up the analysis. The Crail colonial fleet was not their primary war fleet. That distinction mattered enormously and was the reason this was potentially survivable. But colonial fleet was a relative term for a species that had absorbed 42 civilizations. The ships were armed with directed energy weapons of an output that outclassed anything in Earth's official arsenal by 2 orders of magnitude. The hull materials were composites that Earth science could detect, but not replicate. The formation they were holding was specifically designed for planetary suppression. Ships positioned to ensure overlapping fields of fire covered the entire planetary surface, with no blind spot larger than approximately 800 kilometers. No blind spot larger than 800 kilometers. The lunar installation sits in a 400-kilometer depression behind the Montes Cordillera Range, Osei said. Yes, Marchetti said. The orbital array is masked. Yes, and the southern site below the detection threshold of anything they've shown us they could detect, Marchetti said. We've had 11 years to understand their sensor architecture. The southern site is below it. Shown us, Sundar said. We don't know what they haven't shown us, Tanaka said, still not looking away from a screen. We haven't known that for 60 years, and we still don't know it. That's the variable we cannot close. He paused. We proceed on the assumption that our concealment is sufficient and our intelligence is accurate, because those are the conditions under which the system was designed to work, and if either assumption is false, we have no alternative plan. Another pause. We have never had an alternative plan. The room was quiet with the specific quality of people who had known this fact for years and were now feeling its full weight for the first time. Marchetti looked at the fleet display. 42 blue markers at the outer system boundary, patient as a geological event, waiting for a species they expected to fold in 48 hours. I want communications ready, she said. We respond to their 30-hour follow-up. Standard diplomatic holding language. We acknowledge. We are consulting our governments. We require more time. Buy us to the 44-hour mark. They'll push back, Osei said. They'll push back, and then, granted, Osei said, because the pattern holds. They don't deviate from the absorption protocol until the 48-hour window closes. We get to 44 hours, and we have a 4-hour window in which they expect capitulation. And instead, Sundar said, and instead, Marchetti said, we show them what we've been building. She closed the fleet display. She looked at the 12 people in the room. The people who had known about this for years, decades in some cases, who had signed their lives in a classification and budget black holes and family conversations they could never have. And she thought about the 60 years that had led to this specific Tuesday morning. Get some sleep, she said. All of you. We have 31 hours before the follow-up, and I need everyone's cognition at full capacity when it matters. That's an order. They went. Tanaka went last, still moving with his deliberate 81-year-old pace. And at the door he stopped and looked back at the screen where the amber positions glowed. Cavendish used to say, he said, that the universe was going to test us eventually. He just didn't know the shape the test would take. What do you think he'd say now? Marchetti asked. Tanaka looked at the screen for a moment longer. I think you want to know if we passed, he said. He left. Marchetti stayed. She stood alone in the room with the display. Blue markers, white projections, green infrastructure, amber positions. And she thought about 42 civilizations that the Krail had absorbed and what those 42 civilizations had in common and what humanity had decided 60 years ago in a room with a man named Cavendish to do differently. They had all fought on the Krail's terms. Better weapons, bigger weapons, more weapons. The Krail's terms were a frame humanity had decided not to use. They had built something that had no precedent in 9,000 years of Krail expansion. Something that was not a weapon, exactly. Something for which weapon was too small a word, the way an ocean was too large a thing to be described as wet. 31 hours. She sat down. She pulled up the system diagnostics. She started reading, carefully, the way you read something that you need to understand completely before you're allowed to use it. And she read through the night while 42 blue markers sat patient and procedural at the edge of the solar system, waiting for the end of the world they were planning to take apart. They were going to wait a long time. On the screen, the amber positions glowed. Drew Veleth submitted her anomaly report for the third time at the 30-hour mark. She had submitted the first version 3 years ago, when she'd flagged the thermal bloom in the southern desert. The second version, updated with 6 additional data points she'd compiled over 2 years, had been reviewed by the fleet's intelligence division and returned with a notation insufficient basis for threat reclassification. This third version contained the thermal bloom, the 6 additional data points, the 11-day electromagnetic silence that had followed, and a new item she'd added in the last 18 hours. The electromagnetic profile of humanity's current surface activity since the fleet's arrival. It was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that a casual scan would catch. But Drew Veleth had spent 11 years developing an intimate familiarity with humanity's electromagnetic signature. The patterns of it, the rhythms, the predictable busy chaos of a species that communicated constantly and rarely thought about what that communication looked like from the outside. She had built a baseline. She knew what humanity looked like during normal operations, during military exercises, during diplomatic crises, during planetary disasters. She had seen all of it. Since the fleet's arrival, humanity's surface activity had changed in a specific way. The volume was unchanged. The frequency distribution was unchanged. The satellite traffic was unchanged. Every metric that the fleet's sensors were optimized to monitor was exactly where it should be, slightly elevated in the predictable ways that reflected a population under stress. It was too consistent. The specific variability that characterized organic, unmanaged communication was slightly smoothed. Not smooth enough to flag the automated systems. Smooth enough that a person who had been reading the signal for 11 years felt it the way you felt a familiar music box playing a fraction of a tone off, technically within parameters, wrong in your bones. Humanity was broadcasting exactly what it should be broadcasting, which meant humanity was managing what it was broadcasting, which meant there was something it was not broadcasting. She submitted the report. She flagged it urgent. She noted in the flagging notation that in her professional assessment, the threat classification of this target warranted elevation from moderately inconvenient to uncharacterized, a classification that had never in 9,000 years of Krail expansion been assigned to any target at the colonial fleet stage, because uncharacterized meant we do not understand what we are looking at, and the Krail military's institutional confidence was built on the reliable premise that it always understood what it was looking at. Velkareth received the report. He read it. He was a capable officer who had earned his rank through competence rather than caste favor, which made him more open to evidence than most of his peers, and less open to it than the evidence currently warranted. He had overseen 3 absorptions. The pattern was reliable. Biological intelligences under existential threat performed in predictable ways. They activated their highest readiness defense systems. They transmitted encrypted military communications at elevated volume. They massed their forces at optimal defensive positions. They did what they could with what they had, and what they had was never enough. The anomaly Drew Veleth was describing, surface activity that was too normal, did not fit his model of what a species about to fight for its survival looked like. It fit his model of what a species that had already accepted its situation looked like. A species going through the motions of ordinary life because the alternative, mass panic, served nothing. He noted the report. He did not escalate it. Drew Veleth made a private log entry at 0600 fleet time, 18 hours before the 48-hour window closed. The log entry was 7 words. I hope I am wrong about this. Asterisk, the 30-hour follow-up went out at 1:47 GMT, Wednesday. It was, as Osei had predicted, more specific about consequences. It included detailed projections of what planetary suppression would look like, rendered in human visual formats, and calibrated to produce maximum psychological impact without crossing into the category of threat display that historically caused species to respond with desperate offensive action rather than rational submission. The Krail understood the psychology of surrender. They were very good at this. Earth's response arrived in 43 minutes. We are consulting with all relevant governmental bodies. We acknowledge the complexity of the timeline and request a 12-hour extension to the initial window. We are committed to a substantive response. Asterisk Velkareth granted the extension without debate. Committed to a substantive response was, in his reading, the language of a government trying to manage its population's expectation of a fight while privately accepting that the fight was not viable. He had seen variations of it twice before. The species that used this language were the ones that surrendered quietly, which made the absorption cleaner for everyone. He logged it. He went to sleep. In the facility beneath the Australian desert, Marchetti read the extension confirmation and let herself breathe for the first time in 30 hours. 60 hours total, Osei said. 60 hours, Marchetti confirmed. We move at the 56-hour mark. 4 hours of window. We want maximum response time if anything goes wrong before we commit. Nothing can go wrong before we commit, Sundar said. He was looking at the system diagnostics for the 3rd time that morning, in a specific way of a person looking for problems they've already checked for twice, because checking a 3rd time is the only available anxiety management mechanism. If the orbital array is detected before we activate, it gets destroyed, and we lose 1/3 of our output capacity, and the whole thing falls below threshold. It won't be detected, Marchetti said. You can't know that. I know it's been there for 2 years, and hasn't been detected yet, she said. I know we built the masking specifically for their sensor architecture, and the masking has held. I know that this is the best we have, and we have no alternative plan, and so what I'm choosing to know is that it works, because the alternative is spending the next 26 hours in a state of cognitive paralysis that helps nothing. She looked at him steadily. What do you need from me? Sundar was quiet for a moment. Nothing, he said. I'm good. I'm Euphene. He turned back to the diagnostics. I just want one more hour with the coupling sequence before we go to standby. You have it, she said. She went down to sublevel 4, where the physics team worked, and found Tanaka standing at a whiteboard that was covered in notation so dense it looked less like mathematics and more like weather. She stood beside him and looked at it. Walk me through it again, she said. He walked her through it. He had done this for her 14 times in the last 5 years. Since the first full-scale integration test, she developed the habit of making him explain the system in plain language before any significant operation, not because she didn't understand it, but because the act of hearing him describe it steadied her, the same way a pilot reviews a checklist they've reviewed 1,000 times before the flight that matters. The system had no official name. Internally, they called it the frame, a shorthand that didn't begin to describe it, but was the best available word for the concept, which was this. For 11 minutes, at the 3 simultaneous nodes, in a precisely coupled sequence, the system would reach into the physical constants of a localized region of space and change them. Not destroy, not damage, change. The Krail ships operated on physics. They were engineered, tested, optimized, and deployed within a universe that had specific, reliable physical constants. The speed of light, the behavior of electromagnetic fields, the mechanics of energy transfer at every scale from quantum to stellar. Every system on every one of those 42 ships worked because the physics it was designed around was the physics that existed. The frame changed the physics. Not everywhere. Not permanently. In a precisely calculated volume of space, for 11 minutes, the frame would alter 3 specific physical constants in a way that was survivable for biological entities without shielding and catastrophic for technology designed around the original values. Electromagnetic systems would fail, not shut down, fail at the structural level as the materials and geometries that made them work stopped behaving as designed. Energy weapons would misfire or not fire at all. Navigation systems would produce outputs that had no relationship to actual position. The coupling between energy source and drive that made interstellar travel possible would deco here. Not catastrophically, but completely. Ships would go from operational to inert in approximately 4 seconds. 42 ships. For seconds. From fleet to debris. Not debris. They would still be structurally intact, their crews alive, their life support systems functional because life support was passive thermal and chemical management and did not depend on the constants being altered. The crews would be alive. The ships would be dead in space, without drives, without weapons, without communication, without any way home except the way humanity chose to give them. The crew survival is non-negotiable, Tanaka said. It was not a question. He said it every time. Non-negotiable, Marchetti confirmed. It was the answer she always gave. It mattered that she always gave it, that it never required thought, that the decision had been made so long ago it was load-bearing. They were not the Krail. That distinction had to mean something or it meant nothing. The Krail have 17 billion people, Tanaka said. He was still looking at the whiteboard. Distributed across 9 systems. A colonial fleet of 42 ships represents approximately 12,000 crew members. 12,000 people following orders in a war machine they were born into. He paused. They're going to know why we're letting them live. Then, we'll tell them, Marchetti said. Tanaka made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the shape of one. Cavendish argued, in 1987, that the reason species lost to the Krail was that they fought on the Krail's terms, and the Krail's terms favored the Krail. He said the only viable strategy was to fight on terms the Krail had never encountered. He was quiet for a moment. I think he meant something different from this. I think he meant better weapons. Smarter tactics. He didn't know what we'd actually build. What do you think he would have made of it? Marchetti asked. Tanaka looked at the whiteboard. At 60 years of mathematics that had started as theoretical physics and become, through the accumulated work of people who were willing to believe the impossible if the math supported it, something that was about to be demonstrated on 42 alien warships. I think, he said carefully, you would have understood why we built it this way. Not to kill, to remove the capacity for the conflict entirely. He paused. That's not a weapon. That's something older than weapons. Something that wars were always an inadequate attempt to reach. Marchetti looked at the whiteboard. The notation. The years of it. Get some rest, she said. In a little while, he said. She left him there and went back upstairs to count down the remaining hours. And in the solar system's outer dark 42 ships held their positions with the patient certainty of an institution that had never been wrong about this. And in the fleet's intelligence division, a secondary cast analyst named Drew Veleth was reading her own report for the fourth time and looking at 7 words she'd written in a private log and wishing, without knowing why, that she had pressed harder. 56 hours. The clock was running. The frame sat in its 3 nodes, orbital, lunar, subterranean, holding its 11-minute charge, waiting. The physics of the known universe had approximately 14 hours of being reliable left. The 56th hour arrived on a Thursday morning, 3:12 GMT, and the facility beneath the Australian desert came awake with the specific quality of a place where everyone had been technically asleep and actually not. Marchetti was at the central console at 0300. Tanaka arrived at 0301. The rest of the team came in over the next 8 minutes in various states of rest and readiness, and nobody said anything performative about the moment because they were scientists and engineers and strategists who had spent decades working toward this point. And the people who had to perform the significance of a thing were the people who didn't fully believe it was real. This was real. They believed it. There was nothing left to perform. The 3-node integration check ran for 17 minutes. All nominal. The coupling sequence that Sundar had spent the last 26 hours obsessing over reported coherent across all 3 sites. The orbital array, still masked, still invisible to the Krail fleet's sensor architecture, 2 years of undetected patients hanging above the planet, confirmed activation-ready status at 0319. The lunar installation, which Dr. Amara Khatri was running from 400 kilometers away via encrypted quantum link, reported full charge at 0321. The southern site, the site that had been generating thermal blooms for 11 years, the site whose electromagnetic silence had been the first thing that Drew Veleth had filed in her anomaly report, confirmed primary output at 0323. We're green, Sundar said. His voice was so level it had clearly cost him something. We're green, Marchetti confirmed. She looked at the fleet display. 42 blue markers. They hadn't moved in 60 hours. Patient, procedural, waiting for the end of the window and the ritual of submission. Communications, she said. The communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, seconded from the Indian Navy's Classified Research Division 7 years ago and never returned, looked up from her station. Broadcast the following on all frequencies they're monitoring, Marchetti said. Exactly as written. Nothing added, nothing removed. She read from the document she'd been writing and revising for 6 years. To the commanders of the Krail Colonial Fleet, we have received your communications, and we understand your position clearly. You have presented the terms of our absorption into your civilization and implied that the only alternative is suppression. We want you to understand that we have given this serious consideration. What follows is our response. Asterisk, we're not going to surrender. Asterisk, we're not going to fight you on the terms you have established for this engagement. Asterisk, we're going to demonstrate something you have not encountered before, and we ask that you observe carefully, because what happens in the next 11 minutes will determine the nature of every conversation we have after it. Asterisk, we mean permanent harm. We ask that you extend us the same intention, and that you watch. Asterisk on and transmitted it. The signal went out at 0327. Marchetti looked at the fleet display. We'll have their attention in approximately 4 minutes, Osei said. Signal lag, plus the time it takes Velcaratha's communications officer to route the transmission to command. Then, let's not keep them waiting, Marchetti said. Initiate the frame. Sundar's hands moved across his console. Across the planet, in the orbital array, 1,100 individual emitter nodes aligned in a sequence that took 3 seconds to complete. In the lunar installation, Catri's team released the coupling field from its containment state. In the southern site, the primary output array that had been warming for 60 years opened to full output for the first time in operational history. 3 nodes, 1 frame. The mathematics of it, the actual physics, were not visible. That was the thing that people who hadn't spent years in the facility struggled to understand when it was explained to them. There was no beam, no visible effect, no light show. The frame did not project anything. It reached into the fabric of the universe at a distance of 1.4 billion kilometers and changed the values of 3 physical constants in a volume of space approximately 6 million kilometers across, large enough to contain all 42 ships with comfortable margin. And it did this the way you change a number on a page, completely, instantaneously, and without drama. In the Krail fleet, the drama was not absent. It was simply displaced. Every electromagnetic system on every ship stopped, not failed. The word failed implied a process, a degradation, a sequence. They stopped the way a sound stops when the source stops, the way darkness replaces light when the light goes out. The drive systems, which operated on principles that required the speed of light to be what it had been 11 seconds ago, lost their coupling and went inert. The directed energy weapons, which operated on electromagnetic principles, went from armed to structurally incoherent in the time it took an electron to stop being in an expected place. On the bridge of the fleet command ship, Velkareth experienced a sequence of events that he would spend the rest of his life trying to find adequate language for. The lights went out. Not emergency lighting, all of it, because emergency lighting also ran on electromagnetic systems, and electromagnetic systems no longer worked in the way that made them work. For 4 seconds the bridge was dark. Then, the emergency chemical lighting activated. Passive, non-electromagnetic. Orange dim strange. His crew, 16 people on the command bridge, were in the positions they'd been in, mostly seated, all alive, all uninjured, all looking at consoles that had gone dark, all looking at him. Report, he said, because he was trained for crisis, and training fills the space that understanding cannot reach. The reports came. They were all the same report. Nothing. Nothing was responding. The drive was dark. The weapons were dark. The sensors were dark. Life support, passive thermochemical life support, was nominal. Air was circulating. Temperature was holding. They were alive. They could not move. They could not communicate. They could not fire. 42 ships. For seconds. Velkareth sat in the orange chemical light on the bridge of a dead ship and understood in a specific way that a capable officer understood things he had not been trained to expect, that the model of this engagement had been wrong from the beginning. What was that? He said. He said it quietly, into the dead air of his bridge, to no one in particular, because the people around him had no answer, and he was not actually asking them. He was asking the universe, which had just demonstrated that it had been keeping something from him. Drew Veleth was in the intelligence division when the frame activated. She was sitting at her console, reviewing her anomaly report for the 5th time, which was the exact activity that occupied her when the lights went out. She sat in the dark for 4 seconds. The chemical emergency lighting came on. She looked at her dark console. She looked at the screen that had, for 62 hours, shown her the position of all 42 fleet ships and the blue marble of the 3rd planet below and the green line of the 48-hour window ticking toward 0. The screen was dark. She sat with this for a moment. Then, she said, in the private voice of someone talking to a professional assessment that had just been vindicated in the most catastrophic possible way, I was not wrong about this. In the facility beneath the Australian desert, the 11-minute window was running. 9 minutes remaining. The frame was holding. All 3 nodes nominal. The coupling sequence that Sundar had checked 17 times in the last 26 hours was behaving exactly as designed. The physical constants in a volume of space 1.4 billion kilometers from Earth were different from the physical constants everywhere else in the universe. And the technology of an alien fleet that had crossed the void between stars was, in those specific constants, as functional as a compass in a demagnetized field. Fleet status? Marchetti asked. The sensors, humanity's sensors, designed with the foreknowledge of what was coming and optimized accordingly, were reading the fleet clearly. 42 ships, no drive signatures, no weapon charging signatures, thermal output consistent with life support systems only. 42 ships, all inert, the sensor operator said. Life support nominal across all vessels. No casualties detected. Non negociable. Not debated. Decided 60 years ago. Good, Marchetti said. 7 minutes remaining. She opened the communication channel, one way for now, because the frame affected the Krail's technology, but not their ability to receive a passive signal. And she'd had the communication engineers verify this 14 times, and she spoke. This is Dr. Yeva Marchetti, director of the Meridian program, speaking on behalf of Earth Coordinated Response to your arrival. I want to address Commander Velkareth and every crew member of every ship in your fleet. What you've just experienced is not a weapon. It is a demonstration. In approximately 7 minutes, the effect will end, and your systems will restore. Your ships, your crew, your weapons will all return to full function. She paused. She thought about what she was doing, which was talking to 12,000 people who had just had their fleet neutralized and who were currently sitting in chemical emergency lighting, wondering whether they were about to die. We are telling you this so you understand what just happened was a choice. We had 11 minutes. We used 2. We're giving you the remaining 9 to sit in the dark. And consider the following. We knew you were coming. We have known for 11 years. We spent 60 years before that preparing for this moment, not with weapons, but with something else. You've spent 9,000 years absorbing species who fought you on your terms. We declined to use your terms. Another pause. Your crew is alive. Your ships are structurally intact. When your systems restore, you will have a choice. You can attempt to complete your mission, in which case we will demonstrate that this system can be activated again, has been recharged since we first activated it, and will run for 11 minutes each time, and we will continue doing so indefinitely because we have not used a consumable. We have used a physical principle, and physical principles do not run out. She thought about Tanaka, about 1987, and a man named Cavendish, and 2 suitcases and a hope, where you can speak with us. We're not interested in your submission. We're not interested in your territory. We would very much like to talk to the first spacefaring civilization humanity has ever encountered, and we recognize that this was not the beginning of that conversation we would have chosen. We are, however, working with the beginning we have. She closed the channel. 5 minutes remaining. The room was quiet with the quality of a held breath that has been held for 60 years and can now almost be released. Tanaka was standing at the edge of the room, watching the sensor display. The amber positions were steady. The blue markers of the fleet were motionless. In 6 minutes, the constants in that volume of space would return to their baseline, and 42 ships would come back to life in a universe that had, for 11 minutes, been slightly different from the universe they'd been engineered for. They could attack, Sundar said. They could, Marchetti said. The recharge time is 40 minutes. If they move to close range immediately after restoration, I know, we'd have nothing to answer with for 40 minutes. I know. So the whole thing depends on them not attacking. The whole thing, Marchetti said, depends on us being right about them, about what they actually want. She looked at the sensor display. They want to expand. They want resources. They want what every civilization that has ever expanded wants, which is more of what it already has. They do not specifically want to destroy humanity. Destruction is expensive. Destruction is waste. In 9,000 years of expansion, the Krail have never destroyed a species that could be absorbed, because an absorbed species is an asset, and a destroyed species is a sunken cost. She paused. We are offering them an alternative to destruction or absorption. We are offering them something they have never encountered, which is a species that can make their technology stop working and has chosen not to do so permanently. Another pause. Species that can threaten your either enemies or allies. They have never had an ally that wasn't a conquered one. We are offering them a first experience of something genuinely new. She said it the way she'd been thinking it for years, the way the program had been built around it. Not with the certainty of a guarantee, but with the certainty of a calculation that was the best calculation available and had to be trusted because there was no other. 2 minutes remaining. The frame held. The fleet sat dark and still. The universe waited. The 11 minutes ended at 3:38 GMT. In a volume of space 1.4 billion kilometers from Earth, 3 physical constants returned to their baseline values. The change was instantaneous. There was no gradual restoration, no fade-in. The universe in that region simply remembered what it was supposed to be and went back to being it. On the bridge of the Krail Fleet Command ship, the lights came on. Every console came alive simultaneously. Every screen populated with data. The drives registered nominal. The weapons charged to standby status. The sensors came back online and swept the surrounding space with the automatic thoroughness of systems resuming a task they'd been interrupted in the middle of. The interruption had lasted 11 minutes and 3 seconds. Velkareth sat in the returning light of his bridge and looked at his crew, and his crew looked at him, and nobody said anything for a period of time that was not long in absolute terms, but felt architectural. The sensor sweep completed. Range data populated the fleet display. All 42 ships accounted for, all nominal, all in the positions they'd been in when the effect began. No hui breaches. No casualties reported from any vessel. Life support had held throughout. Systems restoration was complete. They were exactly as they had been. The fleet was whole and functional, and Velkareth was sitting in it with an experience that had no category in the absorption protocol and no precedent in 9,000 years of colonial expansion. His communications officer looked up from her console. Commander, signal from the third planet. Broad frequency, human origin. Play it, he said. The signal was not what he expected. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was a set of coordinates, a specific orbital approach path, calculated with precision that indicated the humans understood his fleet's drive geometry, and a single line of text. These are the coordinates for a meeting. 1 ship. We will send 1 vessel. You send 1 vessel. Everything else stays where it is. Asterisk, he stared at the coordinates. His communications officer said nothing. His tactical officer said nothing. His navigation officer had the approach path on screen, having plotted it automatically, and was looking at him with the expression of someone waiting for an order in a situation that the order book did not cover. His intelligence officer, a rank cast specialist named Vendruith, who was deeply conventional and had spent the last 11 minutes looking at his restored console with the expression of a man whose fundamental assumptions have been broken and not yet replaced, said, Commander, if we approach those coordinates, we are entering a zone where what? Velkareth said, Bendruat post. Well, they may be able to do that again, he said. Yes, Velkareth said. They may. They have told us explicitly that they can, and they have told us they are choosing not to. He looked at the approach path on his navigation display. An enemy who has the ability to destroy you and chooses a meeting instead is either the most tactically sophisticated entity you have ever encountered or the most genuinely peaceful one. In either case, the appropriate response is not to demonstrate that you haven't learned anything. Vendruith processed this. Velkareth looked at his navigation officer. Plot the approach. The meeting ship was a modified Krail scout vessel, the smallest ship in the fleet capable of independent deep system transit, crewed by 11 people, piloted by Velkareth himself, because he was not a commander who sent subordinates into the unknown when the unknown was his responsibility to navigate. He brought Drew Veleth. He brought her because she had been right, and he had not listened, and the least the situation deserved was the presence of the person who had seen it coming. She sat in the forward observation compartment of the Scout as they made the approach, looking at the third planet growing larger in the viewport with the expression of someone who had spent 11 years studying a thing at a distance, and was now close enough to see it differently. You knew, Velkareth said. I knew something was wrong, she said. I didn't know what. A pause. Nobody could have known what. Your report said uncharacterized, because I had no category for it. She kept her eyes on the planet. They built something that has no category in our threat matrix. Something we've never seen. A civilization that has been spacefaring for what? 200 years. And they built something that has no category. Another pause. We've been doing this for 9,000 years, and nothing we've encountered in 9,000 years required a new category. The planet was closer now, blue-green and clouded and alive in the specific rich way of worlds where liquid water and atmospheric complexity had been doing creative work for several billion years. He had processed planets before. He had looked at them from a fleet command position and identified them as assets or obstacles. He had not previously looked at one and felt the need to revise his fundamental assumptions about what it contained. How long were they preparing for us? He asked. 60 years at minimum, she said. Possibly longer. The program that built what they used, I've been trying to reconstruct it from the signals we have, and the earliest signal anomaly I can trace that might be related goes back 71 years. She paused. They started preparing before they had confirmed evidence we existed. Velkareth sat with this. They were afraid, he said. They were rational, she said. There's a difference. She finally looked away from the planet and looked at him. They looked at the universe and said, something will come eventually. And they built for eventually instead of now. Her voice had the quality of someone working out a conclusion while saying it. We've been building for now for 9,000 years. We've been very good at it. Every species we've encountered, we've been ready for now. She gestured at the viewport, at the planet, at the invisible legacy of 60 years. They built for the shape of the threat they couldn't see yet. That's not fear. That's a different kind of thinking. The scout ship matched velocity at the designated coordinates, a point in Earth's inner system, high orbit, with the planet below and the stars above, and the fleet a distant cluster at the edge of sensor range. A human vessel was already there. Small, clearly unarmed, though Velkareth now held the category clearly unarmed with less certainty than he had a day ago. The docking connection request came through standard protocols. They had even transmitted the connection handshake in a format compatible with Krail docking systems, which meant they had reverse-engineered Krail docking protocols from 11 years of observation, which was a fact he noted and filed. He granted docking authorization. The connection established with a solidity that suggested the humans had not cut any engineering corners on their end. Then the airlock cycled, and 3 people came through. The first was a woman in her 60s, with the bearing of someone who had spent many years being responsible for large decisions and had made peace with the wait. She walked directly toward Velkareth, not waiting to be addressed. Dr. Yeva Marchetti, she said. Meridian Program. Fleet Commander Velkareth, he said. They looked at each other across the species gulf. He had encountered 42 species representatives at this stage of engagement. They had always looked afraid. It was a sensible response to the situation. This woman did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had done an enormous amount of work and was now in the meeting where the work was going to matter and intended to be fully present for it. The second person who came through was an elderly male, very old, by the physical markers, moving with deliberate care, who carried a battered physical notebook and whose eyes held the specific quality of a mind still working on something even in the middle of a first contact meeting. He was introduced as Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka and Drew Velith, who had positioned herself at Velkareth's left shoulder, recognized the name from the signal analysis she'd been doing for 3 years. It appeared in encrypted communication headers with a frequency that suggested seniority. The third was younger, mid-40s, carrying a data tablet, introduced as Dr. Nadia Osei, who sat down at the meeting table with the air of someone who had been modeling this conversation for years and was now running the real version against the projections. They sat across from each other, Krail on one side, human on the other, the planet below. I have questions, Velkareth said. I expect you do, Marchetti said. We have questions too. I propose we start with yours. He looked at her. The effect you used, he said. The physical constants. How long have you had it? The theoretical framework is 80 years old, she said. The practical implementation took 60 years to build and test. The first full operational test was this morning. She paused. You were the first live test. The statement landed the way it was apparently intended to land, clearly, without cushioning. He processed it. You tested an untested system against a fleet of 42 warships, he said. We tested a system we had run in simulation more than 11,000 times, she said, and whose underlying mathematics have been reviewed by every physicist we could find over a period of 60 years. We were confident in it. Another pause. We were also in a situation where our alternatives were limited. You could have surrendered, he said. We could have, she said. We decided not to. He considered this. He considered the specific quality of that decision. A species with no record of interstellar travel, no allies, no precedent for this encounter, facing a fleet that had processed 42 civilizations, and choosing not to surrender. And he thought about what kind of thinking produced that decision. Not bravado, not desperation, something more structural than either. Why keep us alive, he asked. You had 11 minutes. We would have been unable to respond. The fleet would have been inert for 11 minutes. We know, Marchetti said. We know what we could have done, she said. We chose not to do it. That's the answer. She leaned forward slightly. Commander, I want to be plain with you. We are not a peaceful species in the abstract sense. We have spent most of our recorded history at war with each other. We have done things to each other that I am not proud of and will not minimize. We are not gentle. She paused. But we made a decision 60 years ago when we started building the frame that the way we used it would define what we were. That we were building it to prevent a specific thing, conquest, absorption, erasure, and that we would use it for that purpose and not for revenge or destruction, because revenge and destruction are what we were trying to stop from happening to us. And it cannot be both the thing you're fighting against and the tool you're fighting with. The meeting room was quiet. Drew Veleth was writing in a notation pad. She had stopped writing and was looking at Marchetti. Tanaka, who had not spoken, was looking at his notebook. Then he looked up and across the table at Velkareth, and he said, May I ask you something? Velkareth looked at him, the oldest person in the room, the one with the battered notebook. Yes, he said. In 9,000 years, Tanaka said, has any species ever offered you something you didn't already have? The question was simple. It sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the circles from it spread in every direction before Velkareth had finished hearing it. He thought about 42 absorptions, 42 civilizations with their own histories, their own developments, their own ways of being in the universe. He thought about what had been done with what those civilizations knew, incorporated, assimilated, filed into the Krail knowledge base, and managed as a resource. He thought about 9,000 years of expansion and the things 9,000 years of expansion had not produced. No, he said, quietly. We can, Tanaka said, not because we're better than you, because we're different from you. Different enough to have things you haven't encountered. He held up the notebook. This is 60 years of a kind of thinking your civilization has not done, because you've never needed to. You've always been the most advanced entity in a room. He set it down. You're not in that room anymore. Velkareth looked at the notebook, at the old man who'd built the thing that had turned off his fleet. What do you want? He said. Marchetti answered. We want to exist. On our terms. Without absorption. She looked at him steadily. What happens after that is a conversation we'd like to have. There are 42 civilizations your people have absorbed. They still exist. Their people still live. They're just not free. We would like to discuss that. We would like to discuss a great many things. We've been alone for a very long time, and we have an enormous amount of questions about the universe, and you've been traveling it for 9,000 years. She paused. But existence on our own terms is the non-negotiable starting point. Everything else is negotiable. Velkareth looked at the planet below, visible through the viewport. The specific blue-green of a world where 60 years ago a group of people had started preparing for this exact moment, and had refused for 60 years to stop believing the preparation would matter. He looked at the frame team across the table, at the woman who had built the thing that stopped his fleet, at the old man who had thought of it first, at the analyst beside him who'd been right and not listened to. He made a decision. It was not the decision the absorption protocol authorized. It was the decision the situation required, and after 11 minutes in the dark on a dead ship, he was no longer a man who confused the protocol for the situation. "I will need to contact my superiors," he said. "We expected that," Marchetti said. "Take the time you need. They will not accept these terms immediately. We expected that too. There will be other fleets. There will be other demonstrations," she said. It was not a threat. The frame had been built in 3 nodes. 3 nodes that had already been recharged. She was offering a fact, the way you offered a physical constant. Here is how things work. This is what is true. We can operate on that basis, or we can spend a great deal of time and energy pretending it isn't. Velkareth looked at her. Then he looked at Drew Veleth. Drew Veleth looked back at him with the expression of a person who had written "I hope I am wrong about this" in a private log, and was now in a room where she'd been right, and was finding that being right about this particular thing was nothing like she'd imagined it would feel. "Make your case to my superiors," he said to Marchetti. "I cannot speak for them, but I will not oppose you in that conversation." It was not agreement. It was not even close to agreement. It was the first moment in 9,000 years of Krail expansion when the answer to a new civilization had not been resolved by the fleet. It was in the history of first contact between these two species, the most important sentence ever spoken in a conference room hovering above a blue-green planet on a Thursday morning. Marchetti nodded. "Thank you," she said. She meant it in the specific way of someone who understood precisely how much had just been extended and precisely how much work remained to be done, and who was choosing to mark this moment anyway, because moments like this were rare, and they mattered, and a person who'd spent 60 years building toward one deserved to feel it land. The meeting lasted 4 more hours. It covered less ground than the participants had hoped, and more ground than anyone had a right to expect given where it had started. When it ended, and the human team went back through the airlock, Tanaka was the last to leave. He paused at the airlock and looked back at Velkareth. "The notebook," he said. He held it out. "I want you to have this. Not the science. I'll send you the science through proper channels. This." He offered it across the distance. "This is the 60 years. Every argument we had, every calculation we doubted, every night someone wanted to quit and didn't. I want you to have the 60 years. Velkareth took it. Tanaka went through the airlock. It's sealed. The scout ship separated from the human vessel. The planet below turned its slow, patient turn. The fleet held its position at the outer boundary, 42 ships waiting for a report that would change the 9,000-year-old calculus of what expansion meant. Drew Veleth was at the forward viewport, watching the human vessel move away. "They're nothing like what I expected," she said. "No," Velkareth said. "They're afraid. Just like everything else we've encountered." She paused. "But they built the fear into the machine instead of letting it stop them. 60 years. Before they knew we were real." She shook her head. "They built the answer before they knew the question." Velkareth held the battered notebook. He did not open it. He held it the way you held something that represented more than its physical weight. "Put in the record," he said. "Threat classification for Earth, 3rd planet, Sol system. Uncharacterized." "Uncharacterized," she said. "That's never been used." "It has been now," he said. He turned from the viewport. He had a report to make to people who would not want to hear what it contained, and then a very long argument to have with an institution 9,000 years old. And he was under no illusions about how difficult that argument was going to be or how long it was going to take. He was also, for the first time in a career built on the reliable certainty of the absorption protocol, in a situation where the outcome was not determined, where what he did next would matter in a way that 42 absorptions had not required him to matter. He found, beneath the weight of it, something he didn't have a clean word for. He went to write his report. Behind him, through the viewport, the blue-green planet turned, unhurried and alive and unabsorbed in the light of its single yellow star. It had always been turning. It would keep turning now. That was In the end, what 60 years of work in the dark had been for.